When Claude woke up, it was completely dark. It was strange, he felt that it should have been morning by now. But after a few minutes he felt a little cold, and only then he noticed that he slept not under a blanket, or even on a bed, but on a cold, metal floor. It was then that he realized that this just could not be the case in his apartment. His floors were warm and not metal. He started groping around in the dark, but then the lights came on sharply. Claude saw an empty room, well, almost empty. Except for two more people across the room. A guy and a girl lying in different corners of the room. When the lights came on, the two began to slowly wake up and look around. The guy came to his senses first and began to ask where he was. Claude shrugged, and the girl looked at him in bewilderment. Claude asked the guy what his name was. He said his name was Paul. They both looked at the girl. She looked very aggressive and started yelling who they were and how she was here. Claude said they didn't know how they got here either, and no one was trying to hurt her. Paul assumed that if neither of his two new acquaintances were lying and this wasn't a prank, then obviously they had been kidnapped. The girl started screaming and running around the room looking for a way out. But then a television appeared in the middle of the wall. On the screen they saw a creepy doll laughing. The girl stopped and looked at it in horror. After that, the doll spoke.
"Well, have you had a chance to get to know each other yet? I hope so, because you don't have much time."
Paul had already started screaming curses at him and demanding to be let out, but apparently it was a recording and no one heard them.
"In a few minutes the countdown will start. You'll need to find the code to the hatch."
Claude began to ask where they could get that code, but the question was ignored. Then he too began to shower this maniac with curses.
"You'll only have an hour to get out. And watch your tongues. Time's up."
The screen went dark. The girl sat down on the floor and began to cry. Paul went over to calm her down, and Claude got very angry. So he hears everything they say if he warned them to watch their tongues. Claude saw the camera in the corner of the room and began shouting threats into it that he would find this maniac and make him sorry for what he had done. At this time Paul already had time to meet the girl and learned that her name was Sophie. Sophie was crying and did not understand why she was the one. Claude felt the room had become slightly warmer, but did not pay much attention. He decided to ask them how they had got there. Paul said he didn't remember much. He only remembered getting hit on the head, falling down and waking up here. Sophie answered that she had been attacked as she was leaving work. They hit her on the head, too, and she lost consciousness. Paul and Sophie turned to Claude to find out how he had gotten into this room. Wiping sweat from his forehead, Claude answered that he had gone to bed at home and had woken up here. Someone must have snuck in. Paul took off his sweatshirt and noted that it was getting hot. There was no telling why. He had thyroid inflammation, but never before had his body temperature risen so high. Claude said that he wasn't the only one who got a fever, but when they got out of here, Paul could get a free checkup at his clinic. Sophie added that she could help, too, and she has her own clinic. Paul laughed and said they have a lot in common, since he, too, owns his own big clinic in downtown New York. At this time a picture immediately appeared on the TV. The same doll again.
As you have already realized, you have a lot in common. You all have a medical degree, your own clinic, the ability to decide other people's fates, and a completely rotten soul. All you have in you is lust for profit. I think that you have already noticed the strong change in temperature. You have only 1 hour to get out of this room, otherwise your bodies will be nothing but embers. Good luck.
Afterwards, the television went out. All three of them froze in shock. No one knew what to do. Claude rushed to the hatch and started yanking on the handle, hitting it with his hands and feet. Paul stopped him and said there was no need to waste time on that, it wouldn't help anyway. They have to look for the password. Claude shouted that maybe that password wasn't here and it was a stupid idea. But clearly he can't do anything with his bare hands, Sophie added. They looked everywhere, on the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Paul even ripped a television out of the wall, which he later regretted. There was nothing behind it but a tiny hole with wires sticking out of it. Claude said that maybe the psychopath could have said something else, but thanks to Paul, the only connection was lost. 40 minutes had passed and at first the boys stripped, but when the metal started to leave burns on their bodies, they put their clothes back on. Even though it was unbearably hot, the whole room was metallic, and to take off their clothes was to be burned alive. They risked being boiled in that iron furnace as it was, but it was a way of delaying their time. Sophie cried and sat down on the floor, feeling very sick. She was breathing heavily. Sweat was raining down on her and she was terribly thirsty. Paul, too, had already sat down in despair, and Claude kept trying to find something, sometimes touching the red-hot metal and hissing in pain. Sophie's upper lip had accumulated a lot of moisture and, either out of thirst or desperation, she licked it. Paul froze for a second. He asked Sophie to do it again. She didn't question it and licked her lips again. Paul walked over to her and asked her to pull her tongue out. He was right, the girl had numbers under her tongue. 12, then he asked the same of Claude. He had the number 29, and then he asked Sophie to see what number he himself had. In a gasping voice she said 15. Claude rushed to the hatch and began to enter the resulting numbers. He entered 122915. Wrong password. Paul told him to find out the correct sequence. Claude suggested entering in ascending order 112259, also no. They tried in reverse order and again got nothing. Then they started entering by year of birth, the younger one first, and so on. Still no. Claude suggested splitting the numbers and entering in ascending order again, 112952. To no avail. While Claude walked around and puzzled over the password, Paul began entering the numbers in a chaotic order. After a while, a click was heard and the hatch slowly began to open. Paul immediately jumped into the tunnel, taking care not to touch the metal walls, and then called the others after him. Claude ran towards him, but then he stopped and saw Sophie sitting with her eyes closed. He ran to her to call out, but she didn't answer. Then Claude pulled her to his shoulders, but suddenly there was an unpleasant sound of tearing flesh. Sophie had sat like that for too long, pressed against the wall, and her skin was just welded to it. Paul shouted that she was beyond help and had to run, but Claude wanted to get her out anyway so she could at least be buried. But then he saw the hatch slowly begin to close. Without thinking long, he mentally apologized to Sophie and her relatives and ran for the exit. Claude managed to jump into the tunnel before the hatch closed. They scrambled through it alive, glad of the coolness. Ahead they saw a grate and crawled toward it. Paul kicked it out with their feet and they climbed out into another room. Only now the walls were not iron, but concrete. Paul sat up against the wall and whimpered. "Isn't this the end?" Claude noticed a large closed barrel with a tube sticking out of the top of it. Just then they heard a hiss and turned their attention to the small television in the corner.
"So, how did your first assignment go? Though you don't have to tell me, I can see you enjoyed it. And the lady apparently liked it so much that she decided to stay."
At this point Claude shouted out to the psychopath that he hates him. Paul replied to the guy that it was pointless, he wouldn't respond anyway, even if he heard.
"I'm more interested in how you picked the password. Did you randomly type in the numbers, or did you figure out what it was for? A little hint, it states. Maybe you'll figure it out. In front of you, you see a big iron barrel. There's water in there, you can drink it."
Paul rushed to the barrel, and Claude started to stop the guy. "You don't know what's in there, maybe it's poison."
"Don't worry, it's not poisoned, you can trust me. I don't need to put poison in it to poison you. After all, water itself is poison if you drink it in large quantities. Although you already know that, you're doctors. Well, you have to drink every drop of it. You have to drink it. You can't spit it out. If you start spitting out water, the barrel will fill to the brim again. Don't make it any harder on yourself. At the bottom of this barrel is the key to the door. Once you drain it, the valve on the side will open and you can take this key. Go ahead, I know how thirsty you were."
The screen went out. Paul said there was no choice anyway, and he was thirsty after that furnace. Paul went and sucked on the tube. You can't say Claude wasn't thirsty, he was very thirsty. It even hurt him to talk, but he still had to examine everything first to rule out the rest of his escape options. After about 20 minutes of looking around the room and jerking the door a few times, he realized it was time to help his partner. When Claude approached, Paul was still drinking without taking his mouth off the pipe. Claude asked him how much he had drunk. Paul replied that he didn't know, but that he was very tired of drinking. His stomach was full. Claude immediately replaced him. At first he drank in big, quick gulps and enjoyed it, but then it got harder and he began to drink a little at a time. After a while he stepped away from the tube and lay down next to it. Paul was ready to replace him, but Claude said it was better to take his time and let the amount of liquid that was in them out now. Paul agreed and lay down next to him. Afterwards they tried to look around the barrel to see if there was any way to turn it over or break it, but no, it was welded to the floor and the hatch was firmly closed. Another half hour or so passed, with the guys occasionally sucked the tube for a little while. They wanted to go to the toilet after a while and chose one corner of the room. After all, there wasn't much choice. As the boys sat near the barrel and rested, the TV beeped again. This doll appeared on the screen.
"I forgot to tell you here. You only have an hour left, or the barrel will fill up with water again, and then it will start refilling again and again every hour after that. I hope you've drank a lot."
The mans froze in panic. But then they heard a ticking sound. It was the meter that came up on the screen. Claude turned to Paul and asked how much they had drunk. Paul said 4 liters, maybe less. So there was about 11 liters left. Claude couldn't imagine how he should do that and suggested they take turns drinking, each in 10 minutes. They started drinking, and time was running out. After half an hour the guys felt awful, heavy in the stomach, headache, nausea. But if the barrel suddenly filled up, they certainly didn't stand a chance. So it was either drink or die. They could die either way, though. Another 10 minutes passed and Paul took over for Claude. The guys didn't know how much they had drunk, but it felt like their bodies were already 150% water. It was scary, bad and hard, but they kept drinking. There were 15 minutes to go. But then Paul collapsed, shaking, water pouring out of his mouth. Claude thought the liquid had gotten into his lungs and tried to administer first aid. But no, Paul just fell asleep. His kidneys must have shut down from so much fluid. And his heart couldn't take it either. Claude pointed out that he had spent 5 minutes on this and only had 10 minutes left. Realizing that Paul's fate might catch up with him, he began to drink very quickly. It seemed as if he would pass out at any second. Time was ticking away and it was 5 minutes to go. It seemed to Claude that this was the end. The timer started counting down the seconds. But then Claude felt himself begin to suck in air. The timer stopped. There was a click. Claude crawled to the side of the barrel and pulled the lever. He saw the barrel from the inside, a long tube extending from the bottom to the top. There was a valve at the bottom, which must have been the way the barrel was supposed to be refilled. But there was the thing they had fought so hard for, the key. Claude grabbed it and crawled to the door. He had no strength. Grabbing the handle, he was able to lift himself up with difficulty, and then inserted the key into the keyhole. Opening the door as quickly as possible, the guy ran into another room, locking it behind him. Then he stuck 2 fingers in his mouth and emptied his distended stomach of liquid. Claude, tired and exhausted, fell to the floor. Just then he heard a painfully familiar sound, the sound of a television hissing.
Congratulations to the winner. Well, almost the winner. There's one last challenge left, but we'll get to that later. So you guessed what those dates were. If not, what have you been doing all this time anyway?
Survival, critter.
I can explain. February 12th, that's Sophie's date. On that day, a woman came in for a checkup and was found to have renal insufficiency. A transplant was required, otherwise it threatened kidney failure. A donor was found some time later. An operation was scheduled, but practically on the day of the operation she was informed that a richer client had been found who had paid twice as much as this poor woman. On February 29th, Paul Gilman denied the surgery. The surgery at his clinic was more expensive. The woman didn't have that kind of money. And then finally on March 15th, I think that's a familiar date for you. Your clinic also refused her, saying that they did not perform such operations and could not help her, but the owner of the clinic offered an interesting option. They could make an exception for her only if she gave them a certain amount of money for help, a bribe, to put it simply. In addition to paying for the transplant. The woman ended up dying after both of her kidneys failed. That woman was my wife.
Claude hesitated. He could not understand what it was about. But then he said that it couldn't be at all, because on March 15th he was on vacation and only the head doctor, Sean, remained at the clinic. The doctor in charge, Sean, was the only one left at the clinic. Only no one heard what he said.
I'm giving you a chance to get out. See that mirror on the wall? The key to that door is behind the eyes. You have to get it out of the man in the mirror. I'll give you 2 hours, or the door will slam shut forever.
Claude thought that if he got out of here, he wouldn't leave Sean alive. He went to the mirror in the wall. Claude stared into it for a few seconds, but then it suddenly dawned on him. The man in the mirror was himself. Fear made his stomach twist. He would have to cut out his own eyes to get the key. He fell to the floor and just couldn't believe it. To part with his own eye. He wasn't a surgeon and had never operated on anyone else, let alone himself. The only thing he doesn't understand was how this maniac knew that Claude would be the last one left, and no one else, so he must have known it all beforehand. Or maybe he just implanted a key in all three of them. An hour passed, and Claude didn't even think about cutting anything out. He had one more hour left. There was no doubt in the psychopath's words. There was no other way out. Claude went to the small table by the mirror and took the scalpel, then pointed it at his eye. But then abruptly withdrew it. No, he wasn't capable of that. Claude made a few more attempts, but to no avail. Finally, he sat down in a corner and cried, for the first time in a long time. He got here by mistake, but he couldn't prove it because no one could hear him. Already he was very hungry to eat, to go to bed and rest instead of lying on the concrete. Claude had already despaired and decided that none of this mattered. He would just stay here until he starved to death or the police found him. But then he thought of his wife and children waiting for him at home. He loved his family very much. As soon as he imagined that he might never see them again, there was a kind of confidence in him. But when Claude looked at the timer, he was dumbfounded. There were only 15 minutes left. He grabbed for the scalpel, but it was like something was holding his hand. He was morally unable to do what he was going to do. And time was becoming increasingly short. Then he stabbed a scalpel into his eye with a scream. A sharp pain pierced him, but he didn't stop. When he pushed the scalpel in deeper and realized that the key was not in that eye socket, he began to laugh hysterically. Blood was pouring out of his eye, and he laughed. There was nothing left to do but stick the scalpel in the second eye, which he did. Everything went black. Claude could no longer see anything. His eyes were ragged. But when he realized there was no key in the second eye either, panic and fear gripped him, and he screamed. But then he heard the noise from the television again. He could no longer see the doll, but he could still hear that awful voice.
Very interesting move, Mr. White. What on earth possessed you to do such a thing? And why the eyes in particular? Or wait, no way, did you think I was talking about your eyes? You had to break the mirror with the corpse behind it, and you had to cut the key out of it. You can try to do it all by feel, but I doubt very much you'll make it in the 5 minutes you have left.